That's all right. Welcome all, Plan Stage Weekly, March 31st. Actually, let's Kushal's on, but let's go with your point first, John, because Kushal's is with Alexis out this week. We'll touch on it if we have time, but it's something that we can hold off on. But since there's only one other part, there's only one other topic in the agenda, we probably will have time. Two other parts, yes. All right, so let's skip Kushal, go to John.
Sounds good. Yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah, so this is just a note, something I've been investigating this morning. Anytime you have these interdependent front-end, back-end changes, that is to say, like two things going out at once. So maybe you change the API and you change the way the client uses the API. There are known cause of problems with multi-version deployments. GitLab.com is a multi-version deployment, and not just because we use the Canary environment, but also because we roll out the deployment across the nodes in the production fleet. So at any one time, you can have like all permutations of this at once. You can have new front-end code using old back-end code, new front-end code using new back-end code, which isn't a problem, and all other permutations, right? And that's a problem. So yeah, and we had like a minor incident this morning, I think, with this, and Kushal helped to quickly revert it. In future, there's no real way around this other than to split out the changes, or you can do the changes together, but both need to be backwards compatible. So the first change needs to be additive. That means that you're only adding new behavior, but you're also supporting the old behavior, front and back end. Then once it's been released for a month, like you can see this on .com in our Cabana charts that there's no more traffic to the old endpoint, for example. Then we make the change to remove the redundancy. But the important part is that we can't make assumptions about how clients, like self-hosting clients, are deploying GitLab. They could be using Helm charts and Kubernetes, in which case they have a multi-version deployment as well. And we also want to move GitLab.com, the production web fleet, to Kubernetes in the future. And the way that works is like pods are allowed to expire of their own accord. So you can't be sure how, exactly when the deployment will use the new code. Anyway, long story short, yeah, in future, we need to wait a release before we remove the redundancy. It's a little more awkward, but it'll save us more trouble, I think, in the long run. There's an MR there I'm working on to include this in the guidance for multi-version deployments. Any questions or concerns or anything?
I just noted that we, I think frequently avoid these problems through the use of feature flags. Like I would say most of the features that we roll out, typically have some feature flag, primarily because we have lots of, big, relatively large GraphQL refactor or whatever it is to roll something out. But there's also, it is increasingly arduous to keep those up to date and make sure that we actually use them properly. And then they become difficult to enable because of incidents or whatever else. So I don't know if we want to, and maybe this is Alex's point, document that as a strategy for circumventing this problem. And then,
yeah. So I was just making a note there, but yeah, feature flags also are not atomic. So they won't necessarily roll out across the whole fleet at once. They'll roll out, basically, is what I should have said. So again, like they help, but you can't guarantee, again, that they'll be like, you can't guarantee that users won't encounter this, because it takes, I think, 5 minutes or something, up to 5 minutes to roll one feature flag out across the whole fleet. It depends on the feature as well. Like, I mean, the one this morning, we wouldn't need to worry about the backend change that was made in it, because it was purely additive. It was adding a new field. The problem was that the front end change needed to support also the possibility that that field isn't there, because the front end might be the new front end change, but it hasn't rolled out across the backend servers yet. So it's looking for a field that doesn't exist on those backend servers. And the reverse could be true as well. I think it's probably more common, to be honest, that because even in non-multi-version deployments, you could still end up with the case where an old front-end change remains because a user hasn't refreshed their browser. But yes, actually, like feature flags will help. But again, we need to be really careful with those, because if we end up with a really big change behind a feature flag, we just need to audit that change to make sure that when it's flipped, you know, we should just probably treat it on a case-by-case basis in that.
Yeah, I was thinking like on backend, we don't usually remove stuff. We kind of deprecate and keep backward compatibility. So I'm not totally sure how that appears. Is it mostly a front end thing, or is it because I mean, not that I know of a lot of instances, but I've not seen it being experienced on the backend side. I don't think, at least. I understand what you're saying, that we're rolling out, so we do kind of have multiple versions of GitLab running at the same time on different servers. I don't exactly know how our infrastructure works, and how are we, like, do we have separate servers where we deploy front end and separate servers that we deploy backend? My understanding was more of like, we do have the Rails web app as a whole deployed on different instances, rather than the front end being served by one instance and the back end by another. I don't know if that's possible.
It's possible that your first request to load the web page comes from one node, and then subsequent requests from the front end of the page you loaded are delegated by the load balancer to another node that has different version of the code. Yeah, I see what you're saying about the back end, but like, consider changes where we update, didn't we make a change to make IIDs consistent in GraphQL? So that would have changed the type of IID in some cases. So it does happen from time to time where we would be sending like a string instead of an integer or something like that. And, you know, it's possible we could, in that case, ship a backend change that the front end's dependent upon. I agree, it's probably rarer, but then even like when we come up to 14.0, we should be on the lookout for this as well, because we might be making break-in changes to the internal API.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool.
Did you ask, was that question that you asked there, Alex? Or is that slightly a different question?
Slightly different, but I guess now it doesn't make as much sense in terms of, well, it does, like, if we use different feature flags on backend and front end features for the same kind of feature set, but we use different names of feature flags for parts of the feature, it kind of adds to the number of permutations that may happen there. So, like, I guess a good rule of thumb is try to reuse the feature flag both on backend and front end, to just not add as many like cases to the problem. But yeah. Sometimes it's just not possible, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a good question though. Like, should we be pushing, because we do have cases where we're using different feature flags on the front end and the back end. And not only in addition, not only limited to what we're talking about here, but it's just, I don't know, it's slightly confusing or hard to manage when we have separate feature flags for front end and back end. So I'm all for, if when possible, just sharing feature flags.
Yeah, I guess unless it's by default enabled, you can reuse it. But if it's like set to, it's still there, but it's already enabled by default, you kind of, and you need to introduce something new, you cannot really reuse the feature flag idea. So.
Cool.
Or maybe you can. because then you can just disable the feature flag, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, my question was on if there's guidance on removing the code that we have for allowing for backwards compatibility. But now that I'm thinking about it, like honestly, on the front end, we should probably keep the code that we should probably keep this code in there for a bit, if not forever. Like we don't want to rely on the structure of the backend results. Like we don't want to rely on that completely for the most cases, I think. Like we want to be able to support if something, well, actually maybe not. Now that I'm talking about, well, here, John, you talk about your answer there.
No, it's just on that. I think that if you think about what that front end code might be, like it's still not very nice because, you know, in this case, like the front end code would attempt to look for this field and then would have a, you know, a failed request or 500 error, whatever it is, and would have to react to that with a second request. So it's still not great. It just stops the actual breakage of the application for the user experience. So I think it's a good idea to get rid of it at some point in the next release or whatever. So maybe like the example we gave there is just in database migrations, like we do this kind of expand, migrate, collapse cadence where you kind of you add the new fields in one release, then you migrate all the data. Then once you see no more traffic to this field, you remove it. You don't just simply like change column and then an update in the same migration, you know. And there is clear guidance on that, although I haven't copied it in. I would imagine it's something similar to that. We'd need to create an issue to follow up in the next milestone to remove the actual code that's doing the workaround.
So is this like talking about a specific use case? If we're requesting a field in GraphQL that does not exist on the back end, is that erroring? Like, are we getting an error in those cases? Yeah.
I think so, because just I haven't gone into this MR from this morning, but I think it's causing the epics list not to load in some cases. And what I think is happening there is the new front end code, the user has a new client code. It's asking for epics with this new my emoji reaction filter. And because that filter doesn't exist on the backend node that it's querying, it's getting an error instead. And so it kind of needs to rescue from that error and do something like else that's
okay, I got you. So we don't need to add code to check to make sure that it's available. We just need to handle that error essentially.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So in that case, then I think it makes sense to keep the error handling in there. And that's code that we probably wouldn't want to remove in future milestones or future releases. Because I mean it's just general good practice.
Oh, well, yeah.
To have error handling there.
If it's that general, yeah, probably it's a good idea to have it there, I guess. I don't know, is there logging on the front end for errors? Like, is there a way to capture stack traces or anything?
Through Sentry, but we don't use that all that much.
John, later, could you please paste a link to the issue from this morning? Because I was curious what was circumstances in this case. Because so far, my understanding was that if we make a compatible change in our API and in front-end code, it's still safe to assume that the same change is atomic to some extent, because the request will always be served by Canary. I mean, I thought that there is no chance that there could be a non-canary version of front-end code served by canary version of the code. So I'm still not sure if I got the exact circumstances when we can hit this misversion.
Yeah. So that was the first reaction to this, was to drain canary. But as Mariam pointed out, like, there's still a rollout across nodes, so you still get a rollout across canary and a rollout across production. And
okay,
if we
and
drain,
so from now we should aim this rollout window, deployment window, because it seems to me that it might complicate some code changes quite a bit.
that's my understanding, yeah. And then we already have Psychic in Kubernetes. We have WebSockets being served through Kubernetes, and we want to move the production fleet to Kubernetes. And the way that'll work is that pods in Kubernetes are just allowed to expire when they have stopped serving requests, and then they are killed and reproduced with the new code. So they just kind of, there's no predictability about when they cycle, right? It just kind of gradually repopulate in the deployment. And at that point, it doesn't really matter that there's a rollout. Like, it's just completely unpredictable, and you have to code really defensively for that.
Cool, thank you.
Then there is no way, like, if we are adding a new feature on the back end and front end, right? It's just a new field. Then there is no there is no way to prevent the error from happening other than just handling in a way that, well, we know that this field is not yet there, let's do another request, right? There is just no other way, at least at a first glance. If you cannot, if you can predict that the new front end will always go to the new back end, then we don't have this problem. But in the case when you cannot predict that, you cannot avoid it.
Yeah, that's true. I think
Okay.
unless you were to have, if we were to have some sort of policy, if you like, where we have to roll out the back end change a month in advance, or a release in advance of the front end change, but I think that's much more painful than producing
why is it
redundant
I
changes.
don't see why it has to be a month in advance. It's just like whenever the deployment is happening, it feels like that's when this issue occurs. Whenever the deployment is happening, this discrepancy between the server that sends the request and the server that processes the request is uses two different versions. So you don't really have to do it in a month in advance, but in a way, I don't know if it's possible. It's more of an infrastructure problem, I guess, in that if we can make sure that the new or the updated version is sent to the updated servers, the new requests go to the updated kind of servers, but I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, exactly. That was my thinking too, that maybe the proper fix or solution would be version pinning to make sure that, to assure that actually the same versions talk to each other, instead of trying to make sure that we are always compatible across deployed versions.
Yeah, that the old front end versions can talk to whatever version of the server, right? Because we do keep kind of the backward compatibility on the APIs and requests.
Well, no, we have also internal APIs. So if we are talking about and I think that this would be most common friction when we change, for example, what attributes we pass to a view component, which we initialize in our view, that we change a set of attributes we pass to this component there. And this internal API is not backward compatible.
Okay, makes sense.
But I agree that for GraphQL, this shouldn't, or REST API, this shouldn't be a problem, because we are quite careful about breaking changes.
Yeah, I didn't think about internal API where we initialize these view objects in the HAML and change the attribute set and stuff like that. But yeah, I was mostly thinking about REST API and GraphQL, but it does make sense. Yeah, I agree.
Cool. I put the MR in. There's a discussion in Is It Known as well about this as well. And there is also some other, like this is a known problem across the engineering department that we're trying to get better at. I mean, these are serious problems between front end and back end, but when you get something that we had earlier in the month, which is where tokens were generated using old code and tried, then consumed with new code, that's causes a real problem, because then those tokens have to be, they last, they're persisted. So then the problem is much, much more pernicious and harder to solve. Yeah, so maybe what I'll do is I'll dig out these issues as well and copy them into the agenda so you can read for yourself.
Okay, sorry, I have one point that I just added on this. So I think I answered my own question, but in GraphQL, if something like the example from this morning where we added a field, I believe, to the query, my reaction, and it wasn't available on the back end yet. So we're going to get an error. We have a top level error there. So we're not getting everything else from the epic. We're not getting anything about the epic at all. So in these cases, how do we know on the front end whether to query that or not? Like if we get that error back, then we make another query without it.
That's a good question, I think. Yeah, like one way to solve it, I guess would be to keep some sort of a versioning on the GraphQL API. So, but yeah, it's just something like.
How do we do it on in filtering? Sorry, Jan, if there's a way to do it without, but yeah, how do we do it for filtering if we add on the REST API, if we send in a query that is not, that does not exist on the back end?
So in REST API, I think it's same as with GraphQL. I think if I understand the problem, you pass a field or argument which is not accepted or known to the backend. And in such case, I would expect that you get an error both from REST API and GraphQL. I wanted to ask whether you could inspect the GraphQL schema before you pass this query. So my point is that we expose the whole GraphQL schema, so it should be possible for front end to know before you actually send the request whether this argument is available for a resource or not. So maybe it might be cheaper than trying to send with the field and then on error trying to send without the field.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I don't know if we can get the schema from the backend.
Yeah, I think we can, because if I use GraphQL Explorer for development, and in GraphQL Explorer, there is some auto-completion, so it loads the schema from the server and you can get all the descriptions and a list of fields and arguments. So I hope that we can do something like this in general.
Yeah, I think for REST API, it's slightly different. If you send a param that is not there, it's just ignored, not processed, because we say declared params and so on, and we process those, right? You'll not get an error if you try to send a param that is not defined, sort of, I think is the behavior. Whereas in GraphQL, it's more strict in that way. You cannot send a param that is not known to the schema.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know that. I thought that if you would say a parameter which is not presented, I mean completely different parameter, that you would get an error. So sorry, I was probably wrong about this.
I just like, I think that's how we kind of approach the GraphQL thing in this sense, whereas we should probably, I don't know how expensive it is to check for schema before you do any request. Maybe it's very cheap and something to be done as a middleware thing on the front end, and then you kind of avoid this problem. But it's not sort of doable on the rest, I don't think.
We should probably create a separate issue for this problem because I think it's a little specific to the GraphQL use case as opposed to John's MR. Sound good?
Sounds good.
I'll take that as an action item. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that I just thought about that a little bit. Like in the case of a single page application, we would load that schema once, right? And then that client would think of that schema as being the schema. But in this case, we would have to actually load the schema every time we want to make a request, because we'd need to check that no new additions or subtractions have been made to the schema.
It's a bit weird how we use GraphQL right now, right? Because the intention of GraphQL, we just sort of can get all the graph tree and data sort of in a single request. We can get into debates if that's very expensive and not really performant, and we should break it down. But that's like that's the intent of GraphQL, right? Instead of doing multiple requests as REST does, you just do that. So you ideally you'd load the schema, check it, and then do this, load the data, and so on. So maybe we should try and move to that kind of approach. It's like a long shot, obviously, but
Yeah, that's a good point. That I suspect that checking schema before each request would be too expensive, so it might not be a proper way forward. Cool. Unless there are any other questions to this topic, I have another one. So I just wanted to check what is the expected license or license tier for Epic boards, because I noticed that some issues are labeled with Ultimate, but Epics in general are on premium level now. So personally, I suspect this is just for historical reasons, and some issues still have Ultimate label, but I believe that this is aimed for premium level. So please correct me if I'm wrong, and we should add the Ultimate check for Epic boards.
Do you know, Mark? Otherwise, we should chat with Kristen.
Yeah, I was just trying to dig into an issue here to see if my hunch is it's supposed to be premium. That's where I had scheduled it before Kristen took over planning, but I would double check with Kristen just so that we don't make a mistake here.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. So Kushal was going to talk through some of the roadmap date range filtering we talked about a couple weeks ago. But it's going to lead to some questions from UX and or product. And Alexis is on vacation this week, and Holly had to jump. So do we still want to talk about it?
I think we can discuss it async probably in the same issue where we are tracking this UX, because then I can put all the thoughts instead of discussing here, and like what are the ideas that I have for the first iteration, and then get in the inputs both from UX and product.
Cool. I'm good with that. Anyone else have anything else?
Can we get the total number of epics that we expect on the initial roadmap load to near to 100 instead of 2000? Do you think that's a possibility at some point?
So if we get rid of horizontal scrolling, and so that's what I have planned for first iteration, where we do not allow any form of horizontal scrolling, even for scrolling a fixed timeline. Instead, whatever number of columns that we show for either of the views, be it year, be it quarters, months, or weeks, those columns will stay fixed within the viewport size. And that way we can leverage GraphQL pagination as well. Because then we will get rid of the automatic expansion of timeline that happens right now. And that's the whole reason why we are loading all the 2000 epics at once, because the moment you start to dynamically insert or remove epics depending on where in the timeline user is, depending on the scroll position, we need to have all the epics to be present there, because then sort order goes out of place in case we don't show all the epics at once. But if we get rid of it, then it also allows us to have some form of pagination. Maybe we can have a next previous button at the bottom of the details column of the roadmap, or have some alternative UX like having a load more button, so that once you reach at the end of the list, either we can set the page size as 100, like you mentioned, and show only 100 items. And when user scrolls past all 100 items, they can see either next button or like load more epics, etc. So yeah, obviously there are a lot of ideas that we are exploring, and to come up with something for the first iteration, we need it to be as simple as possible, because not only we will be touching the filtering part, but we will also be touching the pagination part. So.
Cool, thanks. That's really good information. I wonder if, you know, on the initial load of the page, even we could just encourage the user. We could just put pagination on it or a limit on it until the user puts a label of some sort, and then we, you know, we remove the pagination. You know what I mean? Like put a limit of some sort.
So right now, we cannot have unlimited epics anyway, but like we have updated GraphQL backend to have 2000 as the limit. So what happens is when you open roadmap page for GitLab or group, you already see a banner at the top of roadmap which says that there are more epics than shown here. So if we want to just quickly prevent loading all 2000 epics at once in the current design of roadmap, then we can do it. It is just that once you start scrolling horizontally, the event handlers which are there to expand the timeline in either directions will trigger insertion or removal of epics. So if you have an epic which ended, say, for instance, in 5 quarters ago, maybe in like 2019, and if you scroll the timeline and go back to the year 2019, then the request that gets fired to pull in the epic will basically insert that epic into the list. And if user also assumes that the roadmap is sorted by a certain sort direction, like a start or due date, then such an epic insertion will be incorrect within the list. It will not show up at the correct position, which is the reason why I'm not in favor of having infinite scrolling in any way. And we can only remove infinite scrolling if we have some form of alternative there. And that's what we discussed in last plan team call, where Alexis came up with a plan like we can have a 5-year roadmap where users just selects a 5-year plan and then we show everything at once. But then user explicitly knows that they have selected a time frame that is going to take some time to load. But for the initial load, we will show only like the current year or current quarter, and that should narrow down the number of epics that we show by quite a bit.
Awesome, that's brilliant. Thanks. I had a quick question, just follow up. You mentioned that on the back end, it's 2000 is the limit on the GraphQL API, but I noticed the limit on the roadmap is 1000. So can we just drop it to 1000 on the back end as well?
So Jan may be able to comment.
I believe we already dropped this on backend side. So yeah, I will check quickly, but I believe that on backend side it should be already 1002.
Awesome, thanks. I might have been looking at an old issue. I don't want to mention it on a recorded call, but or on a public call. But yeah, I saw an issue about related to the complexity of these requests, and it mentioned that the limit was still 2,000, but it's probably old.
Or maybe not. Now I'm checking, and it seems that epic type still has max page size set to 2000. So we should review this and probably fix this.
That I wonder if it was changed back then, because I think there was a front end issue that was created for this reason, because we had changed it on the back end to 1000 initially. So maybe it got changed back on the back end.
So Felipe might be aware of this change. So like when we started hitting these limits where we were showing a lot of epics at once, and even that wasn't sufficient, then we started with the 1000 limit, but then we realized that we can probably fetch in 2000 epics. I don't know why we had even 1000 as a limit. Like it should have been much lower, because right now the fetch request itself takes over 8 seconds to load, let alone the front end performance that we are facing once the data is loaded. And like Jan mentioned, there is no way around it, because we are recursively fetching epics from all the groups and subgroups and then show it on UI. So if we are going to include 1000 or 2000 results, then it will obviously going to take some time before user can see anything.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll look into that and touch base with Felipe. So I don't know if I included this in the issue for this, but I believe for Epic or for swim lanes, because we have the same issue where on GitLab org, we have thousands of epics, and those are paginated, but not on the UI. So what we're doing is just making, instead of one call for 1000 epics, we're making 10 calls for like whatever the limit is each call. But is that possible when we're using cursor-based pagination to make all those calls in parallel? So two questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to do this, and is it possible?
It doesn't make sense, obviously. At the same time, like I don't think those calls will be happening in parallel, because we won't have cursor information unless we receive response from the first request. And then, so it will basically a cumulative request where the first request would complete, then the second would fire. And after the 10th request is completed, only then we will be able to combine the results. So.
Yeah, so if you would want to do pagination, I guess we would have to think about loading the top parent epics first, and then first load the page of top epics, and then in next requests we can fetch sub epics for these asynchronous requests.
Okay. Anything else?